Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats.
You know, I'm not going to lie. The viewing and listening options we have available to us these days is just an embarrassment of riches. I mean, selfishly, I hope you consider this podcast one of them, but obviously, if you're within the sound of my voice, you must be in the seats with once more. As always, my name is Dave Voigt, and I'm the host of this podcast, where we sit down with a wide-ranging variety of entertainment industry professionals. We pick their brain about current projects, state of the industry, how they got started, and so very much more in a light and in a conversational fashion. And you know, if you like how we do things around here, I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that you do, because let's face it, you're listening right now. If you are, subscribe to that podcast. Smash that button, give us the old 5-star rating. We're available on your platform of choice, pretty much. We're available at places like Apple, Amazon, Spotify, Google. And plus, we archive every single one of our episodes over at our In the Seats YouTube channel. So if you can give us a like and subscribe there as well, we would absolutely appreciate it. Also, don't hesitate to check us out on social media. We are on Facebook, we're on Twitter, we're on Instagram, we're on TikTok, and we're on Letterboxd for all sorts of fun updates. And finally, and I do dare say most importantly, please pay us a visit over at In the Seats, intheseats.ca, for all the latest and greatest from the world of film, television, basically the moving image at large. Because, you know, if we love to watch it and write about it and talk about it, we love it when you come by and read about it and listen about it. So please pay us a visit. On this episode, my goodness, we got a fun one. We are diving into the MUBI streaming service, but indirectly in a way, because what we're doing is we are talking about the MUBI Podcast, which is in its 3rd season now, and we had the unique pleasure of sitting down with the one and only host of the MUBI Podcast, Rico Gagliano, as the show is now in its 3rd season. And I mean, if you didn't already know, the first season, this is sort of a themed podcast. It dealt with a variety of different things. In season 1, they focused on films that have great importance in their home country but are less celebrated by international audiences and critics. And also in season 2, they focused on the stories of individual movie theaters throughout the world that have greatly impacted film history. But in this 3rd season, and I think this is probably one of my favorites so far, it's Needle on the Record, where he dives into the unifying power of movie music, and tells the story behind some of cinema's most renowned needle drops, where filmmakers deployed pre-existing music instead of original score for impact, and that much more. Each episode explores an iconic needle drop that has become a part of pop culture, from, you know, that 19th century waltz in 2001 to the Donnie Darko, the joy of the 80s and that, and so very much more. But like I said, we had the unique pleasure of sitting down with Rico to talk about how he got the job being the host of the MUBI Podcast, which, quite frankly, is a bit of a dream job. He gets to nerd out and produce a podcast and talk about movies all day, which, hey, we do that too. But we talked about that. We talked about sort of the theme for the show and the ideas behind it, and just so very much more. But if you haven't already signed up for the MUBI streaming service, I do recommend you go do that now. I know they got a big sale going on. If you're in Canada, you get the first 4 months for $1 per month. But also go subscribe to the MUBI Podcast, because if you're a film fan or a film junkie, like I'm assuming you are because you listen to this podcast, it is a fantastic listen, and you will learn it and love it quite a bit. But before you do that, though, enjoy our talk with Rico, because between you and me, it is a damn good one. Well, obviously, first off, man, just thank you so much for the time today. I really appreciate this.
Thanks for having me. I'm always happy to talk about movies and my show and stuff.
Well, I guess that walks me into my first question, man, just because, I mean, obviously I got to discover the podcast. I mean, I particularly love the 2001 episode, man. That was like sort of nerdy, deep cut shit for me too. I absolutely dug it. But I guess walk me through, getting the call from MUBI about this job, because, I mean, I've got a feeling like of all the other stuff you've done, this might be one of those calls where it's like, yeah, this is the fun one.
Yes. Oh my God. It wasn't one call. It was like as with many things, it was like a little more of a protracted dance. But what happened was, after doing the show that I'd been doing for like 10 years, the Dinner Party Download, which was started as a podcast, was also a radio show. When that show ended after like 10 years, I was working as a producer on a Focus Features podcast called Zoom, which was named before the pandemic made Zoom mean something totally different to everybody.
Right.
It was hosted by the great Amy Nicholson, and it was kind of not exactly the same, but similar in format and concept to what we do, in the sense that it was like historic deep dives into, in that case, it was like genres, like Focus Features would put out a movie and we would take that genre and kind of talk about the history of that genre. And I like senior produced that and story edited it, and also brought on our music guy, Martin Ostwick. Martin Ostwick is a great podcast composer. He does lots for many, many different podcasts. And he's British, and he knew a guy that worked for Picture House. And that guy therefore listened to our show. Picture House being the British film theater company.
Right.
Or cinemas. And he was, I think, at a party or something, and was talking to a guy from MUBI who was like, we were thinking about doing a podcast. And he was like, well, there's this really cool podcast that Focus Features does, and I know the guy who composes for it, and I think it's really, you should talk to the people who make that podcast. So they got in touch with me, and it was like awesome. And I had been a host for 10 years, and they wanted somebody that could kind of be a one-stop shop that could do everything kind
Right.
of. And it was like, no, for those who don't know, Dinner Party Download is an arts and culture show. Obviously, Focus Features podcast was a movie show. I went to film school, but even for Dinner Party Download, it was like an eclectic show. It wasn't just about movies. It was about movies and food, and it was like a magazine show, basically, arts and culture magazine show. So to get the call, you're right, that maybe I could do a podcast that was solely featuring movies, something that I actually went to school about, like I was a film studies major, right? How many people actually get to then do something other than academia and use that knowledge was kind of amazing. So yeah, hopefully that shows in the podcast.
Well, I mean,
really
it does, man.
to be there.
You're not only living my dream, you're living the dream. But I mean, I love just how you set everything up thematically, with just how movies can play differently depending on where they are, or just the location of the theater. And now this season with music, how did you come up with this idea of really breaking it down to something that ultimately hits very personal? Because I mean, obviously music is an important part of movies, we all know that, but music really takes it kind of to a different level. I mean, obviously people love and know 2001, but when they hear the strains of Also Sprach, it's a different beast.
Yeah, I will say, like in that episode, I think it says something. The moment in that episode, it happens later in the episode than I would want, because it's such a grabby moment. I wish that I could somehow move it to the front, but you need to have some context to really feel it. But the moment where Stanley Kubrick kind of stumbles upon the Blue Danube Waltz as being the perfect thing for the space station docking sequence, that's the moment, because you hear the music.
Right.
And you start to, and as someone is telling you about him having that moment of recognition, and I can tell you that without the music, those two things need to go together. And that's the moment where you're like, oh my God. Yeah, because everybody knows that scene. Even if you've not seen the movie, you probably know that scene. It's featured on the poster, right? It's like one of the most iconic moments in all of sci-fi, and maybe in movie history in general. And like that music is totally a part of it, and it does, you're right, it has some sort of like deeper resonance because of the music. Somebody told me once, it was like the only thing more powerful than sound in sort of yanking you back to a time and place in your life is scent, which obviously movies haven't quite mastered yet. So without that, it's like music is maybe one of the most important things, and everybody knows it. Like Quentin Tarantino has talked about this, everybody's talked about it. Like if you can find the exact perfect marriage of music and image, that's really like the end all be all of cinema. It also, I've found, there's something that I've talked a lot about in this season of the podcast, maybe not a lot, but it's been mentioned several times in the season, that like a lot of times movie music can do the talking for a character.
Totally.
Like, and because I went to film school as a screenwriter, which is of course a funny thing to be, because you're dealing with words and they'll constantly tell you that movies are about images. You want to kind of this changes. Obviously, Quentin Tarantino throws this out the window and it's totally fine. But like generally speaking, like the less dialogue, the better. It's like you want to have a lot of room for image and stuff like that. And it's in a way, music fills the gap that you can leave, that is left by having dialogue out of it. We just talked to Lucas Daunt about his movie Close, and he says that he like is constantly trying to take image out, dialogue out, and use things like motion and music instead. And I think that's the reason, is because it's just more emotional. It makes you feel something rather than telling you.
And is he not one of the nicest guys in the world? I mean, I've had the chance to talk to him too. He is like that man is an absolute sweetheart. I wish nothing but the world for that man and in his success. Seriously,
it's so true. And that's movie. Oh my God, Close is just a heartbreaker. It's so humane.
Now, I mean, I gotta ask, because I mean, just another episode, obviously, with Donnie Darko. I would have never thought sort of a deep dive into the 80s with Donnie Darko, but after listening to your episode, I'm like, oh shit, he's right. It's like what with Donnie Darko, like I never would have equated Donnie Darko and sort of 80s, because I mean 80s music gets used so prolifically in so many different movies. I never sort of put those two together as a marriage for an episode, but after listening to the show, I was like, oh my God, this is perfect. Like, what made you sort of hone in on that for that episode?
I have to say it was like the first thing that came to mind.
Really? Wow. Okay.
And I mean, mainly because there's we talk about two sequences in the movie that use Tears for Fears songs. The first one, the actual original, right, and the second one, the cover of Mad World that they made specifically for the movie. But especially that first sequence, the montage sequence where the tracks through the high school introducing all the main characters while Tears for Fears Head Over Heels plays.
Yeah.
That to me is like one of the great, I mean, that's the perfect example of Tarantino's idea that like when you find the perfect song with the perfect image, it just like makes something bigger than the both of them. That's like almost the epitome of it to me, that moment. And if you go on YouTube, you can find that clip, and it's got millions of views. And there are people that are just like, I wish, because it's an edit of that song.
Right.
It's a shortened edit of the song. And they're like, I wish they'd use the entire song for this. And I can't totally explain why, but it's like, yeah, you wish that moment would go on forever. I wish that montage lasted forever. Part of it is because I'm like an 80s kid. So it did yank me right back to the 80s, and it's set in the 80s. So it's like a very nostalgic thing for me, but there's something even bigger going on there. I try to capture it. I will tell you, the Donnie Darko episode was one of the hardest to do. We're doing an episode this week on Chungking Express that was equally hard for the same reason, which is that both of those movies hit on a level that is really difficult to describe. Like, it's hard even to explain the plots of those movies.
You know what I mean? Man.
And they function on a level that is just beyond the brain. It is beyond intellectual. And maybe that's why it occurred to me, because music is driving those movies in such a way that really makes them work. The music really helps them hit on the level that they do. I don't know, but that for me, it was one of the first things that came to mind. Like, the soundtrack to that movie is so important, even beyond just the Tears for Fears songs. There's so many 80s tunes in there, and it came out at a time when that wasn't being done as much.
That's
it's not
true,
like it inaugurated it. There was things like Grosse Pointe Blank, but a lot of those movies were set in the present day. Yeah. And we're using those movies as a fun, often they were comedies, and they were kind of using it as a fun counterpoint, or it's like something that people listen to in a kind of jovial way. This was a movie that, like, in a way, like, it used it in a totally different way, and used it in a drama, used it in a like some sort of different way, I feel like.
No, I love that. I mean, it made me watch the movie again this weekend, and you're right. There's so many layers to the film. It's so fascinating, especially, the use of music. But I mean, just to start putting a bow on this, because I don't want to take up too much of your time.
I could talk about this stuff forever.
Oh God, we both could. But yeah, I mean, honestly, there's one thing I got to ask, because I mean, as you and I both know, as content creators, as podcasters, I can imagine there are days where it gets to be a bit of a grind, where you're just slugging through stuff. Like, for you, is it the joy of the material that you get to put out there? Because especially in these shows, like these movie podcasts, like, there's definitely joy in the material. There's love for the source material that comes out in your shows. Like, at the end of the day, is that the payoff for you when it comes to doing all this hard work?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for saying all that. No, it's absolutely the thing. And there's one other thing. I think I've had a few people say something to me that is I hoped would be recognized, but I worried was maybe too subtext, but it's definitely true. If you were to say each season of the show is about a different overall topic. First season was like movies that were only popular in one country, but were hugely popular in that country. Second season is about movie theaters and their contribution, individual movie theaters. Third is all about music. But if there's a thread through all of these things, it's like about, at bottom line, it's about how art is important and art brings people together. Because in all of these, in almost every episode, to me, like the best part is the kind of culmination in the second act of each of these episodes, where it's like this movie that you've been following, how it came together and all the ideas that went into it and stuff comes out and then has this cultural impact that is huge. And that brings a lot of people together. Maybe not a movie, or in the second season, it's about movie theaters. You know, some guy has this idea for how a movie, either a movie that they should play or a theatrical experience they should create or something. And then it just like people get into it. And I feel like now maybe more than ever, it's important to talk about about things that can bring people together, and specifically about movies, since there's so much conversation now about kind of how it's all becoming very disparate, how movie theaters are starting to fail.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also how movie theaters are starting to fail and people aren't coming together to watch movies as much as they did. I think that's an important experience to have.
Yeah.
And I think without it, something is lost. And also just in general, respect for art. Like the art has an impact, cultural impact that really changes people's lives and brings them together and makes them think on the same wavelength, or at least think about the same things. Whether they think about them in the same way is, of course, up to them. But that is something that I think powers me through the very many days where I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe how long I've been working on this episode. Is like hopefully putting something out there that maybe makes people think about art, and especially movies like that.
Well, art is such a fantastic unifier, man. But I mean, brother, keep doing the good work, man. Because I mean,
Thanks.
I'm eating up the show. I can't wait until the Chunking episode drops, man. But seriously, keep up the good work. And honestly, thank you so much for the time today, and keep spreading the good word about the joy of cinema.
Thank you. You do the same, and thanks for spreading the word about the show. I hope folks listen.
And don't forget to visit our friends over at Bay Street Video for all your DVD, Blu-ray rental, or purchasing needs this summer, as they are still open for curbside and some mailing delivery as well. Over at 1172 Bay Street, Toronto, Ontario, Canada, you can give them a call at 416-964-9088. That's 416-964-9088. Or send them an email at baystreetvideoto@gmail.com for any of your DVD and Blu-ray needs.